Good morning, everyone. I really want to thank Yolanda and Vicky for the invitation to come here. It's been a really interesting day and a half listening to everybody's research, and it's an honor to present this to you. I'm going to talk a little bit today about language and the acculturation of Chinese immigrants' ethnic identity, and this is the start of a longitudinal project that's going to take place over the next 5 years, so this is almost our first wave of data, but you'll see there are maybe room for some improvements. I will talk about that. But other people have talked about the context of Canada, so I'm just going to recap that. So we're a population of 35 million, of which almost 21% is immigrant, and another 20% are the offspring of immigrants. We take in about 250,000 people each year over about the last decade, and we are increasing that target to 300,000 this year. I know you know what Canada looks like. You're all here. Where I come from, that bottom picture, that bottom map is the 1911 census, which is the year that my city was founded. And you can see in that dark green blob over here, I'm a bit Vanna White here. This is Alberta, okay, on the west. And so 115 years ago, more than 50% of the province was immigrants. And now in 2011, we're now at about 30% of the province is immigrants. So we're new. We're a new country, and a lot of people 4 generations back were immigrants. These data here show the permanent residents by top source countries in Canada. And when I counted up the number of countries that people come from, I counted 177 different countries. And then there was a category called no country mentioned. And then there was another category called other countries. So I'm thinking Canada gets immigrants from virtually every country in the world except maybe North Korea, maybe a few other places like that. So that's a lot of languages that people are coming to the country with. But you'll see that there's actually some countries that are really well represented, the Philippines, India, and the People's Republic of China, and that's typical of the province that I come from too. So these are the number of mother tongue speakers with speakers numbering 100,000 or more. And what I want to point out here is that Chinese, not otherwise specified, Cantonese, and Mandarin are separated here. So if you put them all together, you'll see that Chinese is a very widely spoken language in Canada. In groups of this size, the retention rate is about 70%. So people are using their home language, their native language, as their home language. Okay. Now, with regards to immigration, about 5 out of 6 newcomers speak French or English to some extent upon arrival. And I thought this was really interesting fact. The last place I saw it reported was 1 in 6 newcomers speak French or English. Only one of 6. No, how did I rephrase that? It was very alarmist. 1 in 6 doesn't speak enough English or French. In the Vancouver Sun article that was reporting on this statistic. I see that the other way. Actually, most people can speak some degree of English or French. But at least 40% are eligible to take the federal government's language courses. So they do need some improvement. When asked what was one of the most important things for immigrants coming to Canada for their success, Jason Kenney, the former Minister of Citizenship, Immigration and Multiculturalism, said, critical pathway to success for immigrants in Canada is language. And that's not just in Canada. Germany's Federal Minister of the Interior, Thomas de Maizière, said that when asked what do immigrants need, he said language, language, language. So language and immigration has been studied actually quite a bit with regards to economic integration. So whether people are getting jobs, whether they're getting jobs at the level that they had back in their home country. It's also talked about with regards to civic integration. Are people voting? Are they volunteering for community organizations? And looking at language and social psychological integration is not as well understood. Just following up a little bit on this policy issue, knowing that language is really important for integration, we have had lots of different kinds of policies in Canada and throughout the world. In January this year, David Cameron made it into the Canadian news with lots of discussion because of a policy that was introduced, which was designed to facilitate Muslims women's integration into British society by saying that if you don't learn English within 2.5 years, you're going to have to go home. So that's a pretty disruptive policy. And I don't know about you, I'm kind of a language geek, and it's taken me a lot longer than 2.5 years to learn language. So, but you know, I can make fun of that policy, but I'm reminded you won't know who that is unless you're from Canada, what that book is. Does anyone from Canada recognize that? Yeah, so that is a book and a song that was created by Gordon Downey, who was lead singer of the Tragically Hip, and it was about the story of an Indigenous boy who was in a residential school who ran away from the school to find his home and froze to death on the way. And in residential schools, children were not allowed to use their native language, and they were beaten if they did, or many of them were. So Canada has had its fair share of nasty policies too. So the first research question that I want to talk about is, how does ethnic identity of Chinese immigrants change as they adapt to Canada? And then how does language and communication relate to this process of identity acculturation? And I'm interested in ethnic identity because I think when we start to talk about how the new culture becomes a part of our identity, that's when we're really talking about it becoming it's a very central part of us at that point. So our definition of ethnic identity that I've been working, this framework that we've been working with, I have to mention Richard Clément. We've been working on this since I was a doctoral student. And from our perspective, and many people's perspective, ethnic identity refers to a subjective experience of belonging or allegiance to one or more ethnic groups. And following acculturation research, we would maintain that at least 2 groups are relevant, including the ancestral or heritage ethnic group and another ethnic group. And in the case of immigration, that would probably be the group of the dominant society. So in Alberta, that would be English. We also maintain that ethnic identity is affected by aspects of the social context, including the immediate social situation. So we maintain that ethnic identity is situationally variable, such that it depends upon the person with whom one interacts, the setting and the activity of conversation in which one is engaged. So this is coming out of a communication sociolinguistic perspective. So we've come up with the perhaps unfortunately named acculturation penetration hypothesis, playing sort of on notions of social distance and social penetration. But we maintain that acculturation is likely to take place first in those situational domains where we have the greatest opportunity for intercultural interaction. And eventually, as members of other ethnic groups are incorporated into other domains of our social network, acculturative shift becomes evident in those domains. So in the case of immigration, this premise means that typically we see acculturative shifts in public domains, for instance, when we're at school or at work or in the community, before we'll see those kinds of shifts in the family domain, okay, because of whom we're interacting with. And with regards to language and identity, we draw from work in communication research, looking at the work of Young Kim, and she maintains that identity is negotiated, and well, she and many others maintain that identity is negotiated through language and communication practices. Language and communication resources afford or constrain the possibilities for identity negotiation. So if you can't speak a language, you have a lot more difficult time negotiating an identity that's consistent with that target language group. So in the acquisition of new language and communication routines, our cultural identities can shift. And so what we're saying here is that language competence should moderate identity profiles across situations. And I'll speak to that a little bit more in a bit. Okay, so the guiding research questions then is, how does the ethnic identity of Chinese immigrants change as they adapt to Canadian society? And 2, how does language and communication relate to the process of identity acculturation? So in this research, we're looking at Chinese immigrants to Canada, in part because they are one of the largest immigrant groups in the province of Alberta. And in Alberta, I think it's important to know that Chinese immigrants, when we think about them on the dimensions of competence and warmth, our students see them as being moderately warm and high competent, and that would be consistent with French Canadians. So they're perceived relatively positively. We had 98 Chinese immigrants in Canada for less than 6 months. Their mean age is 35 years. They're 45% male. At least almost 90% had some degree of post-secondary education, and their English study was about 12 years prior to coming to Canada. So it's a very highly educated group. So quite a contrast, I think, from some of the groups and the situations that we've been talking about in the last day and a half. We have also Chinese immigrants in Canada between 3 to 4 years, so we have 2 cohorts. 3 to 4 years was significant when we started this study because in order to become a Canadian citizen, you had to have lived in Canada for 3 out of 4 years. That's changed a little bit, and then it changed a little bit. It's changing a little bit more. So now that's maybe not quite so meaningful, but at the time, that was the point where we thought, okay, around this time, people are going to be thinking about their identity and possibly undergoing some identity change. There wasn't any difference between the 2 groups, the 2 cohorts, except in years, and I don't know about you, but the difference between 35 and 38 didn't make a whole big deal of difference in my life, so I'm not too worried about that difference. Well, actually, when I was never mind. Let me think about that. Kids happened in there. Okay, so we recruited, so these are non-student sample, and we didn't want anyone included who was an international student. So we wanted people who migrated to Canada, economic migrants who migrated to Canada with the intention of eventually acquiring Canadian citizenship. So we recruited through flyers and emails to community organizations, posters in Chinese businesses, advertisements, word of mouth, just about any way we could. We went to a lot of Chinese festivals and handed out flyers, much to the annoyance of festival goers getting multiple flyers. We had face-to-face interviews, usually on campus. These lasted about 2 hours. The interviews consisted of completing a questionnaire, an interview about identity and language in Chinese with a native Chinese speaker, and then an English assessment with a native English speaker. There were lots of course, Rupert mentioned that he collected lots and lots of different variables, and we did very much the same thing. But I'm going to just talk about a couple of things. So I'm going to talk about our situated ethnic identity scale. We also assessed, just to confirm what I said about contact and language use being important, we assessed contact with Canadians and English use across 5 situational domains. Using just a simple item, during the past month, how frequently have you interacted with Canadians at work, from never to always. And we assessed English language competence. So to assess English language competence, we decided that oral proficiency, so a big question for us is exactly what is it about language that's so important for identity and for acculturation and for change? People have looked at accent, people have looked at vocabulary. Most people in acculturation research might have I read, write, speak, understand, a self-report of some kind. So there's a myriad of ways that we can be looking at language, and one of the things we're trying to pin down is what is it about language that's important. So we started with the speaking assessment that has been developed by the Canadian government to assess oral proficiency. So the Canadian language benchmarks are a series of standards that immigrants have to achieve. They have to get up to number 4, which is a very basic conversation in order to apply for to get citizenship. So it's a meaningful standard to immigrants in Canada. This was correlated 0.72 with the CLB score that was given to the participant by the government. So we developed our own version of the test with the help of a CLB assessor. So we were pretty pleased to see such a high correlation between those two measures. And we also assessed, what I'm going to talk about today is anxiety using English, using a scale developed by Richard Clément and Susan Baker. And it has a negative 4.49 correlation with the speaking assessment. So anxiety using the language is not the same thing as your, I suppose, objective or actual competence. It overlaps, but it also has a proportion of the variance that's distinct. So the situated ethnic identity scale is something that we've developed through focus groups and focused essays, and we started people off in the morning when you wake up. Who are you with? What are you doing? What are you talking about? Where are you? And we've gone through focus groups with different English and French Canadians, Spanish and English speakers in the US, immigrants in Western Canada. And we've sampled, I think, to saturation, where we have a good sense of what people do during their day, and we developed an instrument, scenarios based on what people do during the day that they're willing to tell us. The most commonly endorsed situational domains include family, friends, being at university if you're a student, being at work if you're not, and the community. And our Cronbach alphas within each domain are generally quite high. Probably the lower ones are about 0.85. So just to give you an example of a community situation, so while grocery shopping, I discuss the price of various products with the cashier at the checkout. I feel, and then we ask people to use the two scales independently. We're thinking of this from an acculturation perspective. So you could be high on one group identity and low on the other group identity. You might be high on both identities, kind of an integration idea, or you might decide in that situation ethnicity isn't relevant and you might be low on both of them. And if you've never been in this situation before, for instance, some people don't have grandmothers and that's one of our items, then we take that situation out and don't include it in the computation of the mean. And just to give you an example of a more intimate situation, I'm having coffee with a longtime friend and we're talking about our personal problems. I feel, again, use the two scales independently and tell us how you feel with regards to these two groups. Okay, so I just wanted to show that consistent with our acculturation penetration hypothesis, that we do see a shift. People have contact with Canadians to different degrees across the home, friends, schoolwork, and community domains. The interaction with the two cohorts wasn't significant, so there was a tendency for those people who had been here longer to have more contact in the work domain, but unfortunately that significant t-test didn't hold out with the f-test there. Same with English language use. People are using English, least at home, a little more with friends, but most at work and in the community. So let's look at identity then. So I'm going to show you all this and tell you that the three-way the interaction wasn't significant, but I think it's intriguing. And is there a, thank you. I have to go up in front. Okay. Is that on? It's on. Okay. So if you look out here at the people who have been here less than 6 months, what you'll see, the green is the Chinese identity and yellow is Canadian identity. And what you can see is in the family situation, there's a big gap. So people feel very Chinese and not at all Canadian. But when you look at what's going on in the work, school, and the community domain, that gap is attenuated. Canadian identity is still higher, but I'm sorry, Chinese identity is still higher, but Canadian identity is catching up. And then in the friendship domain, we still see the gap that we see in the family domain, but it's attenuated. When we look over here at the people who've been here for 3 to 4 years, you can see a similar gap, although it's slightly smaller than this one. And you can see the Canadian identity is starting to peak up above the Chinese identity in the school, work, and community domains. Now, unfortunately, that wasn't significant. the identity by situation interaction is significant, and it has a consistently across studies, the partial eta squared is about 0.49, in the 0.4 to 0.5 region. Okay, thank you. Okay, so this just recaps what I said. So although there's a tendency that suggests there's an acculturative shift, it wasn't significant. So what that means to us is that, 5 minutes, okay, so what that means to us is that if there's an acculturative shift, it takes longer than 3 to 4 years, or maybe a critical event has to happen, like people get citizenship, or or maybe some other critical incident has to take place. One of my students said that a critical incident for her mother was when she learned to cook a turkey. So I'm not quite sure if it's just length of time or some special event. So how does language relate to this? Well, language did change over the year. So the Canadian Language Benchmark Assessment went up and language anxiety went down. What we did was we split the Canadian Language Benchmark scores at the median, which was 6, and we looked at the patterns of identity. And I'm not going to go into this one because, again, the three-way interaction didn't pan out, although there's a tendency in the way that we would expect. But what was more important was the anxiety. So for those people who, based on a median split, for those people who had low English anxiety, wow, my graphs turned out different. Okay, so for those people who had low English anxiety, now we've got Canadian identity is in yellow, Chinese identity is in green, and what you can see, if their people are not anxious, you can see that their Canadian identity is significantly stronger than their Chinese identity in these more public domains. But if they're highly anxious, we don't see as much of a change. So it would suggest to us that being comfortable using the language, more so than being having an objective assessment that says that you're competent, is more important. So anxiety may be particularly important for acculturative changes in identity. Now, I don't have time to go through the mother tongue, but we see a parallel situation with Chinese heritage language learning in people who've arrived very young and in the second generation. So if they don't feel comfortable using their Chinese heritage language, they aren't going to identify as strongly with the Chinese group. Okay. So what we would conclude is so basically, identity profiles depend upon the social situation, and we think this fits in with a perspective on acculturation as something that's dynamic and changeable across situations, and something that's developmental. So if identity change occurs, it may take longer than 3 to 4 years and/or may depend on critical events. And we've started collecting data from people who've been here for longer than 10 years to have a look at when those identity changes might take place. And identity profiles depend on language resources, particularly our own confidence. So we're still delving into looking at different measures of language to see what might be better predictors. A lot of people have looked at accents, so we are looking at people's accents, vocabulary items. There are certain cognitive measures one can use to look at how well the language is represented in a bilingual mind. And we'd want to know why those language measures would be so important. We're also very interested in the transactional nature of identity, this idea that we must negotiate identities with other people, and that necessitates a look at the dyadic process that's going on, maybe some conversation analysis. It also points out the importance of looking at people in those domains, and we've become very aware that immigration is not an individual journey in many cases, it's a family journey. And that's something that we'll be looking into in the following waves. So I just want to say thanks to a whole bunch of people who've helped, collaborated, and research assistants and students who've been involved, and our funding agency. And Thank you to you for listening.